Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. When you raise thousands of deadly snakes for a living, danger is part of the job. But in Montgomery County, Missouri, it wasn't a reptile that killed Ben Rennick. It was something colder, smarter, and much closer to home. On June 8, 2017, the Rennick Reptile Farm sat quietly along a remote stretch of countryside just outside New Florence. There was no screaming, no broken windows, no chaos, just a locked gate, a warm sun, and a facility housing over 3,000 exotic snakes, many of them large enough to kill a man if they wanted to. That afternoon, Sam Rennick, Ben's brother, arrived at the property. He hadn't heard from Ben since the night before, which was unusual. Ben wasn't the type to disappear or miss calls, especially not when there were feedings scheduled. Inside the main breeding facility, the air was heavy. Rows of glass enclosures stood silent. In the far corridor, Sam found his brother lying face down in a pool of blood near a stack of caging supplies. Rigid, cold. The 911 call logged at 6:45 p.m. would mark the beginning of a homicide investigation that would unravel a carefully masked motive buried beneath routine, family, and million-dollar business. Deputy Sheriff Justin Fortney was one of the first on scene. He later described the site as clinical and surreal. No signs of forced entry, no blood trails leading outside, no weapons in sight. The body was already showing signs of lividity. At first glance, there were no visible wounds consistent with a snake bite. That assumption would be confirmed quickly when coroner staff documented 8 bullet wounds, 6 to the back, 2 to the head. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control was called in within the hour. It was immediately treated as a homicide. Ben Rennick, 29 years old, was not your average rural entrepreneur. He was a nationally respected breeder of high-end ball pythons and reticulated pythons, some of which sold for tens of thousands of dollars per animal. He had built the reptile farm from the ground up, expanding into a 72-acre property that was just beginning to turn lucrative. He was also a husband and father of 2. His wife, Lindley Rennick, reported to authorities that she had last seen Ben that morning. She said she had been home with the children and hadn't been to the farm that day. Her demeanor, by early reports, was muted but composed. Within the first 48 hours, investigators worked through the fundamentals: canvass the scene, collect evidence, and isolate variables. There were no forced entry marks. Surveillance cameras inside the facility had been switched off, not damaged or removed, but intentionally powered down. That detail alone placed the killer as someone who was either comfortable navigating the facility or had access to sensitive operations. The farm's security system showed the last recorded motion at 4:23 p.m. the previous day, nothing afterward. A technician confirmed the system had been manually turned off from inside the server room around that same time. That same hour coincided with Ben's last outgoing text to a friend regarding a routine cage shipment. But the autopsy narrowed the timeline. Ben was shot from behind, with multiple entry wounds to his upper back, 2 of which severed major arteries. The shot to the skull was delivered post-mortem. The angle and spread of wounds suggested that the shooter was standing just a few feet away and fired in rapid succession. All casings collected at the scene were 9mm. There were no fingerprints on the floor or door handles, wiped or gloved. Forensic analysts couldn't say yet. The snakes, perhaps mercifully, had witnessed the entire event, but they couldn't testify. Forensic priority was placed on 3 key areas: the camera server room, possibly tampered with; the office safe, which showed no signs of forced access; and the concrete walkway where a partial shoe imprint had been recovered, embedded lightly in what appeared to be dried blood spray. In communities like Montgomery County, crime isn't an abstraction, it's personal. People don't lock their gates to hide crimes. They leave them open for neighbors to stop by. Ben's death wasn't just a crime scene, it cracked open the local ecosystem, both economically and emotionally. The list of possible suspects remained open at this point. Robbery didn't appear to be a motive. Nothing had been taken. There was no evidence of a dispute, no smashed tanks, and no graffiti or threats. Investigators noted that the reptiles alone were worth well over $1.2 million, and yet every enclosure remained untouched. By the end of the 3rd day, law enforcement had begun mapping Ben's inner circle. His business partners, employees, family members, and acquaintances were all subject to preliminary interviews. No red flag stood out, but sometimes the absence of a red flag is itself a flag. Lindley's interview was routine. She confirmed her husband's schedule, financial dealings, and the state of their marriage, which she described as under pressure but stable. She mentioned Ben had recently discussed scaling back operations and focusing on fewer, more profitable snakes. She called his death a shock and said she was still trying to comprehend what happened. Detectives, however, quietly requested her phone records and banking activity through a sealed warrant. Not because of anything she said, but because, as one officer noted, she said too little, too perfectly. By the end of the first week, the investigation hadn't stalled. It had simply entered a deeper stage. The forensic team was still working on ballistics. The single bloody shoe print was sent to Quantico for analysis. The casings were matched preliminarily to a common 9mm model, widely available and easy to conceal. Meanwhile, the reptiles were relocated under supervision. The facility was sealed with crime scene tape. The snakes were logged, tagged, and in some cases, removed to outside buyers. Ben Rennick's funeral took place 11 days after the murder. He was remembered as a visionary in his field, an attentive father, and a meticulous businessman. But behind closed doors, investigators weren't writing eulogies. They were outlining timelines. And already discrepancies were beginning to surface. In homicide investigations, digital footprints are rarely clean. They're layered, reactive, and filled with tells. The second week of the Ben Rennick case marked a shift from the visible scene to the invisible systems that governed his life. A full forensic extraction was conducted on Ben's personal phone and office computer. The last outgoing communication, sent via text at 4:23 p.m. on June 7th, referenced a standard cage shipment scheduled for that weekend. That timestamp matched precisely with the final motion recorded on the internal camera system before it went offline. Investigators flagged the coincidence. The shutdown wasn't accidental. The internal server log confirmed that the camera system had been manually powered down from the software panel inside the reptile facility. Whoever had access needed an admin login and password. Only 2 individuals held that level of clearance: Ben himself and his wife, Lindley. Detectives didn't jump to conclusions. Digital access doesn't equate to guilt, but it does narrow the circle. A formal data request to Verizon, with warrant, returned GPS and call history logs for both Ben and Lindley's phones. Ben's movement was static after 4:30 p.m. His phone never left the farm. Lindley's, however, showed no pings in that area on June 7th. Her call log also went quiet after 3:56 p.m. No outgoing texts, no social messaging activity until almost 10 p.m. That wasn't proof of anything. People grieve differently, but the silence didn't fit her usual usage pattern. Cell tower triangulation further confirmed she had been home in Montgomery City during that time frame. On paper, she had an alibi. Investigators turned their attention to Ben's business records. Over the past 6 months, financial activity had become erratic. Bank statements revealed that large cash transfers had been made from his personal account to cover shortfalls in a local spa business registered under Lindley's name. The spa, Ascend Wellness, was located in Columbia, Missouri, about 45 minutes from the farm. Public records showed it had been incorporated in 2016 with Lindley listed as the primary owner. A background check revealed the spa had fallen into debt within 18 months. Past due notices, vendor complaints, and a defaulted equipment lease painted a picture of financial distress. On June 10th, detectives interviewed a part-time bookkeeper who had worked for Ascend. She confirmed that Lindley had discussed being overwhelmed and needing to fix everything before Ben finds out. The phrasing stuck with investigators. The timing matched the period leading up to the murder. A secondary review of Lindley's bank account showed a deposit of $100,000 on June 15th, less than a week after Ben's death. That money had been transferred from the Rennick Reptile Farm business account. She now had sole control of the operation and its assets, as stipulated in their joint trust. At that point, the probate filings were still pending, but a financial motive was no longer abstract, it had foundation. Agents examined Ben's insurance policies. 2 were active. a personal term life policy valued at $500,000 and a business protection policy valued at $1 million. Both named Lindley as the sole beneficiary. Investigators requested the insurance applications and payout details. Nothing appeared fraudulent, but the timing was again notable. Both policies had been renewed and adjusted for higher value in early 2017, just months before the shooting. Detectives made no accusations, but internally one thing was becoming clear. If the murder was financially motivated, the benefits were immediate and quantifiable, and they flowed in a single direction. Parallel to the financial review, digital analysts traced browser activity on Lindley's home laptop. On May 18th, a search string caught attention. How to overdose someone with pain pills. The same phrase was also found in the search history of her spa computer. When asked about it in a second, voluntary interview, Lindley stated she had searched for information regarding a friend's drug use and was concerned about opioid abuse. She declined to identify the friend. The team didn't challenge her statement. Instead, they filed the logs and pivoted to the next task, mapping every movement Ben made during the final week of his life. This included vehicle GPS logs, vendor interactions, surveillance from local gas stations, and even trail cam data from the far edges of his farm. One detail surfaced quietly but disturbingly. On June 5th, just 2 days before the murder, Ben had attempted to schedule a meeting with a probate attorney in Jefferson City. Emails indicated he wanted to discuss succession planning and reevaluate all beneficiary assignments. The appointment had been confirmed for June 12th, 5 days too late. The attorneys at the firm later told detectives that Ben had sounded uneasy. He was vague, one of them recalled, but he said he didn't want to wait any longer to make changes. It's common in financial crimes for a victim to sense pressure before others do. But by the time someone acts, they're often already out of time. At the end of week 2, investigators had several pieces. A manual shutdown of surveillance tied to internal access, a significant financial incentive, evidence of opioid-related research activity, a planned meeting to change estate beneficiaries, a victim with no known enemies, and a surviving spouse with total financial gain. There were still gaps. No murder weapon had been recovered, no confession, no eyewitness. But the data had a direction, and sometimes in homicide cases, that's enough to keep pressing forward. One detective summarized the situation bluntly. He didn't get robbed. He didn't owe money. He wasn't in a feud. This was personal, and it was calculated. In most homicides, violence escalates over time. That escalation doesn't always show up in bruises or screams. It hides in subtle preparations, trial runs, and near misses. By mid-June 2017, the Ben Rennick investigation moved beyond immediate forensic anomalies and into behavioral intent. The search warrant issued for Ascend Wellness Spa turned up more than just financial records. Investigators located a personal laptop used frequently in the back office. The hard drive contained browser history and local file logs. Among routine scheduling documents and vendor invoices, one folder, buried in the temporary cache, contained research queries focused on prescription painkillers. The timestamps were specific. On May 18th, less than 3 weeks before Ben's death, the device was used to search, "Can Percocet kill you? Signs of oxycodone overdose in sleep. How much oxy is fatal?" The entries weren't spaced out. They were made over a single 19-minute window. A toxicologist assigned to the case later reviewed these queries in context with what came next. Detectives contacted the spa's employees. Several had worked irregular shifts but maintained access to both the office and the storage room, where over-the-counter and controlled supplies were sometimes kept. One esthetician, who requested her identity be protected, voluntarily came forward with a statement. She told investigators that, in late May, her employer had seemed agitated. She remembered an offhand comment, "I gave Ben something to help him sleep. He's been too tense lately." The detail on its own wasn't alarming, but it became more relevant when cross-referenced with Ben's own texts during that same week. On May 20th, he messaged a friend and fellow breeder. "Had the weirdest crash last night. Out cold for hours. Like I got hit with a brick." He made no follow-up complaint and didn't mention it again. But that one message aligned with the timeline of the online drug searches. Investigators now had reason to believe that Ben may have unknowingly ingested a large dose of opioids, likely disguised as a sleep aid. A full toxicology screen had been performed during autopsy, standard protocol in violent deaths. At the time, it showed no presence of opioids, but it also confirmed the obvious. Ben had died from massive internal bleeding due to multiple gunshot wounds. However, investigators now requested records from area pharmacies, looking for any controlled prescriptions purchased under either Ben or Lindley's name. That search turned up nothing, so attention shifted to possible alternative access routes. One supplier who had formerly worked with the SPA confirmed that a large bottle of expired Percocet had once been part of a discontinued treatment package. He claimed it had been returned, but didn't have paperwork to confirm the disposal. It was never found at the spa. Its absence became another loose thread in an increasingly frayed narrative. A secondary interview with another employee revealed more. She described a conversation in which Lindley allegedly joked about trying to poison her husband and said he could sleep through a hurricane if she mixed his drink the right way. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, the employee said she hadn't believed it was serious. That phrase, hadn't believed it was serious, is a common refrain in premeditated crime. In hindsight, it's often the difference between preventing a murder and reconstructing one. Investigators didn't treat the overdose attempt as conclusive evidence of intent to kill, but it revealed a test, an attempted incapacitation. If the dosage had been higher, if Ben had reacted differently, the outcome might have changed. The critical point was this: someone had already rehearsed an exit scenario weeks before the shooting occurred. The case file now included a behavioral escalation timeline. May 18th to the 20th, opioid-related search history, unexplained heavy sleep episode. May 27th to 30th, financial account reshuffling, inter-account transfers. June 1st to 5th, digital silence, stress level decline in Ben's text. June 6th, phone call with an attorney about estate changes. June 7th, homicide pattern matters in crime reconstruction. It informs intent, it guides motive, and it begins to place proximity of opportunity next to psychological preparation. Still, there were no direct witnesses to the event, no gun recovered, no confession. The forensic team began comparing the blood toxicology of Ben's May 20th blood donation, retrieved from a regional blood bank, with new testing requests. It was a rare but potentially powerful cross-check. Unfortunately, that donation had already been used. There was no backup sample. Meanwhile, records showed that Lindley's SPA had suspended 3 appointments on June 7th. All 3 clients were contacted. 2 confirmed they had been rescheduled due to a family emergency. The third had no recollection of the cancellation reason. The forensic team flagged this activity, not as criminal, but as circumstantial pressure building toward an unknown but now imminent act. In criminal investigations, escalation without confrontation is rare. But in this case, there had been no confrontation, only increasingly subtle moves made in private. One of the case investigators later summarized it as, "She didn't try to run, she tried to normalize." That normalization, steady life, scheduled clients, childcare, was deceptive. Behind the routine, steps had already been taken to remove obstacles. Forensic planning was already underway, and one attempt had already failed. But she hadn't stopped trying. By the 3rd week of June 2017, investigators had enough baseline evidence to understand the internal dynamics of the Rennick household. What they lacked was a clearer picture of who else had been orbiting the crime and how close they'd gotten. That clarity arrived through a secondary phone number. A routine subpoena for Lindley Rennick's cell phone records revealed a consistent pattern of contact with an individual not previously mentioned in interviews: Michael Humphrey. His name had not appeared on any of the farm's employee rosters, nor in business documents tied to the spa. But the call logs told a different story. Between May 25th and June 7th, there were 17 calls exchanged between Lindley and Michael, some lasting over 30 minutes. A few were placed during hours when Lindley claimed to be off-grid. The investigation team flagged the number and ran a full identity check. Michael Humphrey, 34, had a minor criminal history, possession charges, unpaid citations, but nothing violent. He lived in Jefferson City, about 45 minutes from the Rennick property. He was also, according to archived social media data, an ex-boyfriend of Lindley's from years prior. Their relationship had ended before she married Ben, but there were no formal restraining orders or signs of conflict. Surveillance footage from 2 gas stations near the Rennick farm, cross-referenced with license plate data, confirmed that Michael's car had passed through New Florence on the afternoon of June 7th. Specifically at 2:12 p.m., a black Nissan Altima registered to Humphrey was captured pulling into a pump lane at a rural station. He didn't purchase gas. He remained inside the vehicle for under 2 minutes, then drove off. The timestamp placed him less than 7 miles from the Rennick property 4 hours before Ben was declared deceased. That movement wasn't proof of involvement, but it aligned too closely with the phone records to ignore. Investigators then secured search warrants for Humphrey's home and devices. On his phone, they found deleted messages recovered via forensic software. Brief but pointed. "Don't forget gloves. Front entrance cam will be off. Be calm, I got this." The messages were time-stamped June 6th and 7th. While they didn't contain names or addresses, the context, paired with surveillance and travel records, added substantial weight to the theory that Humphrey had knowledge of or participation in the crime. In interviews, Michael initially denied any recent contact with Lindley. When confronted with cell tower data, he admitted to seeing her once or twice in June, but claimed it had nothing to do with Ben. According to his statement, they'd reconnected briefly to talk about stress. He offered no further details. One investigator later summarized the exchange. "He kept answering questions we hadn't asked yet. That's always a tell." From there, attention turned to the firearm. The ballistics team had confirmed that the 9mm rounds recovered from Ben's body matched standard barrel rifling. Clean bore, civilian issue. No shell casings had been traced to a purchase directly connected to Lindley or Ben. However, Michael had previously pawned a 9mm handgun in late 2016. That weapon had changed hands 3 times. Its current owner cooperated fully and turned the gun in for ballistics comparison. It didn't match. Still, the timeline placed Michael in proximity, with motive unconfirmed, but behavior increasingly erratic. Investigators interviewed one of Michael's co-workers, who remembered him acting distant in early June, asking to trade shifts without explanation. Another acquaintance mentioned that Michael had seemed nervous and asked hypothetical questions about cell tower tracking. Meanwhile, Lindley had not disclosed her renewed contact with Michael in any of her prior interviews. This omission, paired with the digital evidence, justified reclassifying her as a person of interest rather than a cooperating spouse. Prosecutors began preparing for the possibility of dual indictments, pending confirmation that Michael's presence near the farm could be physically tied to the crime scene. Forensic soil samples were taken from his vehicle. Partial matches to a specific type of gravel, unique to the Rennick property's rear drive, were documented, but not conclusive. The challenge now shifted from who had access to who executed. Intent can be suggested. Movement can be mapped. But execution requires either a witness, a confession, or irrefutable trace evidence. In many cases, outside actors complicate motive, but in this case, they appeared to clarify it. At this stage, the case file took on its first fully integrated theory, that a third party had been invited into the circle. Not by coincidence, but by design. Someone needed backup. Someone needed distance. But when backup becomes a liability, silence becomes a strategy. By late June 2017, the investigation into Ben Rennick's murder had reached a critical junction. There was no single confession, no recovered weapon, no direct eyewitness, but the convergence of digital trails, behavioral patterns, and a secondary player, Michael Humphrey, brought the case close to its first major crack. What shifted everything wasn't physical evidence. It was pressure. A confidential informant contacted investigators through an attorney. He claimed to have personal knowledge of conversations involving Michael Humphrey, held weeks after the murder. The informant was Brandon Blackwell, Lindley's boyfriend at the time of her arrest and father to her youngest child. Brandon had a prior domestic charge, but his information was specific and verifiable. He stated that Lindley admitted to planning the murder with Michael. She allegedly described how they had driven to the farm together, how Michael had backed out, and how she had to do it herself. That claim was not recorded, but Brandon agreed to wear a wire in subsequent meetings. The wired conversation, conducted in a vehicle outside a daycare, captured Lindley avoiding direct answers, but not denying the original claim. When Brandon asked, "So it was you that did it then?" her response was, "We talked about this already. I told you I don't want to go through it again." Prosecutors considered it circumstantial but powerful enough to warrant formal charges. At the same time, Michael's statements began to fracture. In a second interview now conducted under Miranda, he changed his story. He admitted driving to the farm but claimed he stayed in the car. He stated that Lindley went inside alone with the firearm and emerged minutes later, shaking and silent. He described her placing the gun in a plastic bag and handing it to him without speaking. He claimed he disposed of the weapon in a rural area, but could not specify the location. Search teams combed the property with metal detectors. No firearm was recovered. Michael was charged with second-degree murder. Lindley was charged days later. From a forensic standpoint, the evidence remained circumstantial. There were no prints on the shell casings, no video footage, and the surveillance system had been shut down before the shooting. But the weight of the circumstantial layers had become overwhelming. In legal terms, the timeline had finally solidified. A failed poisoning attempt, financial motive through insurance and inheritance, surveillance manipulation, coordinated communication with a third party, a semi-admission captured through a wired conversation, a co-defendant pointing the finger. The decision to charge both was not taken lightly. Prosecutors knew the absence of direct forensic ties could become a vulnerability at trial. But in cases where technology has been manipulated, intention often becomes the strongest weapon of truth. Murder, when well planned, rarely leaves fingerprints, but it does leave patterns. By the time 2025 began, public attention on the Zalinsky case had grown quiet. The murder had happened in 2021. The suspect, Kamil Zalinsky, had already been deemed unfit to stand trial due to mental illness. But Connecticut courts had a legal obligation to reevaluate him regularly, and that's what led to the most controversial hearing in the case. March 2025. According to the court psychiatrist's final report submitted in late February, Kamil had responded well to supervised treatment. Over nearly 4 years of hospitalization, he had consistently shown no further signs of acute psychosis, no violent behavior, and was described by staff as cooperative and stable under medication. The state-appointed medical team concluded that while he still suffered from schizophrenia, his condition was manageable under strict compliance. They recommended conditional release. That conclusion did not sit well with the prosecution. At the March 2025 hearing, the state's legal team presented the autopsy photos again. Grace Zalinsky's skull fracture, defensive wounds to her forearms, the lacerations to her scalp consistent with multiple blows from the axe. They emphasized the brutality, arguing that someone capable of that level of violence should never be released, regardless of current mental status. The prosecutor also introduced digital forensic records. Between July and September 2021, Zalinsky had conducted over a dozen internet searches related to how to get rid of voices, schizophrenia symptoms, and can God talk through animals. While not explicitly violent, the search history added context to his deteriorating mental state before the crime. It reinforced their belief that he posed a long-term risk. However, the defense leaned on the precedent set in Jones v. United States, 1983, which allows for release from psychiatric custody if the individual is no longer considered a danger and has received adequate treatment. The defense psychiatrist brought in independently confirmed Kamil's consistent medication adherence, lack of delusional thinking for over 18 months, and successful completion of multiple psychiatric evaluations. Most critically, he no longer claimed to hear voices. The hearing stretched over 2 days. Grace's sister testified, her voice controlled but firm. "He may be medicated now, but Grace is still dead. We buried her. She has no second chance." The gallery was silent. Then came the court's decision. On March 12, 2025, the Superior Court judge issued a formal ruling. Citing the medical findings and constitutional protections, the court ruled that Kamil Zalinsky would be released from the Whiting Forensic Hospital under strict conditional supervision. He would be transferred to a long-term residential psychiatric facility with electronic monitoring, no access to weapons, and mandatory weekly check-ins. Any violation would result in immediate recommitment. Public backlash followed swiftly. Online forums and news comment sections filled with outrage. Many called it a failure of the justice system, but others, particularly from mental health advocacy groups, defended the decision as a necessary balance between justice and humane treatment. The Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services issued a statement days later, stating that all necessary safeguards were in place. "This is not freedom," the statement read. "This is continued treatment under legal supervision." Meanwhile, Grace Zalinsky's grave remained quiet. Her family chose not to hold a press conference. Instead, her sister released a written statement through a family friend. It read, in part, "Our goal was never vengeance, but accountability. We are disappointed, but we know who Grace was. She was not defined by how she died, but how she lived, with love, reason, and compassion." This ending raised questions. Questions not about guilt, but about systems. About how justice functions when mental illness erases intent. About the limits of punishment. And about how a single act of unchecked delusion can destroy a life, a family, and the fragile idea of safety at home. 3 weeks after the March 2025 ruling that granted Kamil Zalinsky conditional release, public discourse surrounding the case shifted from legal analysis to systemic accountability. Multiple state legislators, citing constituent outrage, pushed for an emergency review of Connecticut's psychiatric release protocols. A special committee was formed within the state's General Assembly by April 2025. Its goal was to examine whether the criteria for release of individuals previously found not guilty by reason of insanity, NGRI, were too lenient or inconsistently applied. The Zalinsky case became a central reference point in this discussion, not just because of its brutality, but because of its aftermath. Several local news outlets obtained internal documents from the Whiting Forensic Hospital under the Freedom of Information Act. These records revealed that Zalinsky had missed at least 2 scheduled therapy sessions in 2023 due to staff shortages. Although hospital administration claimed those gaps had no long-term consequence, they cast new doubt on the stability of his recovery. Meanwhile, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, DMHIS, was pressured to present its tracking and risk assessment protocols before the committee. During a public hearing held in Hartford in May 2025, a lead administrator acknowledged that electronic monitoring used for conditional releases like Zalinsky operated on a geofencing model, designed to flag if the subject strayed beyond approved perimeters. However, it did not monitor behavior within those zones. In short, the system could confirm his location, but not his actions. From an investigative standpoint, this limitation concerned risk analysts. A 2024 study by the Forensic Psychiatry Review Board noted that recidivism rates for NGRI defendants released under supervision were statistically low, less than 2% nationally, but the risk wasn't zero, and in extreme cases, consequences could be irreversible. Back in New Britain, Zalinsky's reintegration into a semi-structured psychiatric facility proceeded without public knowledge of the location, per privacy statutes. Security professionals confirmed that his identity had been removed from online public inmate registries to prevent vigilante incidents. There were no known violations of his release terms as of June 2025. But the controversy sparked ripple effects across the state. Families of other victims whose killers had been declared NGRI contacted local media, expressing concerns that the same outcome might await them. One woman whose brother was killed in 2018 by a schizophrenic neighbor, later found insane, stated plainly, "I don't want revenge, but I want to know someone like that won't be allowed back into a neighborhood ever again." Legally, there was no mechanism to retry Zalinsky. His acquittal on grounds of insanity stood, and any further action would violate double jeopardy protections. However, policy reforms did move forward. By late June 2025, Connecticut passed Bill 479F, requiring annual psychological assessments by third-party providers for all conditionally released psychiatric defendants. It also mandated that any incident of noncompliance, missed appointments, medication refusal, location breach, be reported directly to the state court within 72 hours. The Zalinsky case had become a blueprint not for what justice looked like, but for what procedural oversight failed to prevent. And while the system did not collapse under the weight of this one case, it changed. Notably, public opinion remained divided. Some viewed the outcome as a betrayal of victims. Others saw it as a rare moment when the legal system, deeply flawed though it was, held itself accountable to both rehabilitation and risk management. As for Grace's family, they did not participate in the hearings, nor did they attend the policy discussions. They had said all they would ever say. What remained were the facts. One woman murdered in her own home, one man shielded by psychosis at the time of the act, and one legal system trying, belatedly, to draw new boundaries between protection and treatment. In 2023, Camille El-Tayeb was found not guilty by reason of insanity in the fatal stabbing of his mother, Alam Ahmed. The court ordered him committed to Whiting Forensic Hospital under the Psychiatric Security Review Board's authority. There, doctors confirmed his schizophrenia remained severe, requiring indefinite confinement for public safety. By 2024, Connecticut lawmakers had begun scrutinizing the insanity defense system. Alam's case, along with others, sparked SB 498, a new law requiring a minimum 5-year inpatient term for homicide acquittees found NGRI. It also created restricted registries and tightened oversight, closing the gaps that failed Alam. Camille's psychiatric records revealed missed warning signs, treatment lapses, prior hospitalizations, and a lack of supervision. Though stabilized on medication, he remained a long-term risk if released. In May 2025, the board ruled to keep him confined indefinitely. Her family launched the Alam Project, an initiative supporting relatives of untreated mentally ill adults. Quietly, Alam's legacy became one of prevention and reform. Looking back, I've realized that behind every headline, there's a mother, a family, a life altered forever. If there's one thing Alam's story has taught me, it's this. Mental health isn't just a personal issue, it's a community responsibility. Ignoring the warning signs, dismissing cries for help, it costs more than we ever imagine. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. What do you think could have been done differently? Do we need stricter intervention policies or more compassion? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this video touched your heart or made you reflect, drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't resonate, tell me why. I'm here to listen. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case that could change the way we look at justice, one truth at a time.